This afternoon, we're joined by the acclaimed architect and writer, Michael Sorkin. Michael is president of Terreform, a nonprofit dedicated to urban research and intervention, and publisher of UR Books, the principal of Michael Sorkin Studio, and an international design practice, and distinguished professor of architecture and director of the graduate program in urban design at the City College of New York. Michael is also the architecture critic of The Nation, contributing editor at Architectural Record, and author of 20 books, and editor of 20 books. And that's enough of me. Please welcome Michael Sorkin to the stage.
I'm going to skip the entertaining anecdote about why I've written this text and why I may go a little bit long. However, if I appear to be speaking too fast, please intervene. It's not possible to speak today without acknowledging the nauseating and indeed frightening development in our politics that took place last week. Something fundamental has changed, something with particular bearing on the subject of this conference. Indeed, if one were to look for an epitome of the ways in which private interest can avoid public responsibility, Trump would be the poster child. His failure to pay taxes, his fraudulent charity, his serial bankruptcies, and his amazing exploitation of every abatement, bonus, loophole, and subsidy to be had from government make him a model citizen for our age of greed, America's all-time most successful welfare queen. And because he has so prominently achieved his, hold your applause, achieved his success in the built environment, his special version of the public-private relationship is at once exemplary and cautionary. When the Donald descended the gilded escalator in Trump Tower 18 months ago, he was passing through a space that we'd paid for in the form of a zoning bonus that allowed his building to rise all the higher. Was this deal truly in our interest? Was this even a territory our democratic planning process should have entered? Democracy is a system for the balancing of public and private interests. Now, this is skipped ahead by about 10 minutes. You're messing with me. Reset the clock. Democracy is a system for the balancing of public and private interests, and in the process, it invents the boundary and character of both. More precisely, democracy is a means by which the idea of a public is constituted through the expression and collusion of a multitude of individual desires. This suggests three terms to be considered in understanding the diversity of possible democracies: the construction of the private subject, the practices that enable the coming together of those individuals to create their collectivity, and the nature of the public itself, including the habits, rituals, and regulations that define its manifold behaviors. However, it's crucial to stress that each of these terms can and has been open to enormous variation, interpretation, and transformation. We Americans founded our particular democracy on the basis of a white male citizen subject, excluding women, Native Americans, people of color, and the unpropertied. Indeed, we secured those men's freedom on the backs of a multitude who were literally enslaved. Our history has been dominated by struggles for access to this franchise and the instruments of both opportunity and oppression in channeling it: poll tax, literacy tests, stuffed ballot box, gerrymandering, unobtainable ideas, and the long history of differential empowerment based on wealth. This is now institutionalized by the obscenity of Citizens United, which, in a blow that will exercise its destructive effects down the generations, thanks to the reactionaries with whom Trump is likely to stuff the Supreme Court, has sealed that special distortion of democracy that characterizes its capitalist forms: the influence of money. More on this in a moment. If democracy defines its subjects, the nature of their enfranchisement, and the media through which they constitute themselves as a public, it is also defined and transformed by its results on the ground. Something we've come to acknowledge in recent years that's especially crucial to us urbanists is the fact that there is not a single public, rather multiple ones. One of the scariest things about the Trump victory is that it's such an atavism, a reversion to the idea of a uniform and singular public, a republic of poorly educated white men. This flies in the face not simply of the arc of our national development as a proudly plural democracy, but is a particular affront to New York City and its embrace of diversity, to our gorgeous mosaic, as David Dinkins called it. To be sure, the particulars of that diversity are troubled. We have one of the most segregated public school systems in the nation. Our income gap is an obscenity, and our neighborhoods become more and more inhospitable to the poor and to people of ordinary incomes, and suffer the homogenizing pressures of a multinational corporatist culture that seems determined to put a Starbucks or a pret-a-manger on every corner. This does, however, bring us around to the question of space, our own special concern. It's surely consequential that the origin tale of our democracy is rooted in ancient Athens. This is not simply because the Greeks coined the word and refined the practices of representative governance, but for us especially because Athenian democracy was so rooted in physical space. Its locus classicus is the agora, the scene of free interaction, of disputation and negotiation that, along with the apparatus of a constituent assembly and direct voting, marks both the mechanisms of democratic governance that are general to this day and also the enduring relationship between democratic space and urban space, the merger of the idea of democracy with free assembly. Indeed, it is precisely this right, guaranteed in our Constitution, that comprises the main expression of democracy in space. In You Have to Pay for the Public Life, an insightful, if somewhat sardonic article written in 1965, the architect Charles Moore riffs on the contradictions and conundrums embedded in the private provision of public space. He begins, in fact, with Ortega y Gasset's invocation in The Revolt of the Masses of public spaces as central not simply to democracy, but to the very idea of urbanity, per Ortega. The urbs, or polis, starts by being an empty space, the forum, the agora, and all the rest is just a means of fixing that empty space, of limiting its outlines. The square, thanks to the walls which enclose it, is a portion of the countryside which turns its back on the rest, eliminates the rest, and sets up an opposition to it. Ortega y Gasset was clearly thinking of the classic Mediterranean square, but his formulation might be as readily applied to New York's most abiding form of the extracted countryside, the park, which carries rich additional valences. Indeed, Central Park is our agora, and its inflection in favor of leisure rather than debate speaks volumes about our own culture. In fact, Moore's piece is largely about Disneyland, which he calls the most important single piece of construction in the West in the past several decades. Disneyland is situated in the general placelessness of California, especially Los Angeles, a morphology Moore describes as bound to defeat all attempts to describe any traditional forms of public space in its dissipating sprawl and its boundless, uncharitable horizontality. But Disney, he writes, has created a place, indeed a whole public world, full of sequential occurrences, of big and little dramas, full of hierarchies of importance and excitement. He dryly notes, however, that the range of public possibilities is not entirely complete, lacking for one, the political experience, but that it's nonetheless enormously successful just because it recreates all the chances to respond to a public environment which Los Angeles no longer has. Then his signal irony. Curiously, he writes, for a public place, Disneyland is not free. You buy tickets at the gate, but then Versailles costs someone a great deal of money too. Now as then, you have to pay for the public life. Moore concludes by suggesting that the establishment of a public realm in California and elsewhere depends on, quote, more Disneys, on men willing to submerge their own Mickey Mouse visions in a broader vision of a greater public interest, who are nonetheless willing and able to focus their attention on a particular problem and a particular place. Moore is surely a foundational document in describing and positioning our contemporary styles of ceding the responsibility for public placemaking to private initiative in the United States. It does this, like the classically ambivalent book of Bob Venturi and Denise Scott Brown on Las Vegas, via precisely the conflation of Versailles, truly a weird example in its implicit analogy of courtier in bizarre wigs with tourists in mouse ears, Disneyland and Caesar's Palace. The comparabilities for these writers have to do both with a classically understood spatiality and with a public experience that is thoroughly commercialized. Moore's throwaway caveat about the exclusion of political speech from these places is central to this. Indeed, the Vegas Strip and Disneyland are two of the most restricted environments for speech and assembly on the planet, Pyongyang grade in their censorship and policing. Of course, we've all heard this before. I did a book on the subject 25 years ago and was hardly the first to observe this drift, but the truth of the condition abides. What's new and should be of interest to us is not, this clock is definitely twice as fast as, what's new and should be of special interest to us is not simply the architectural, urban, and cultural character of these spaces. No need for more moaning about the Disneyfication of Times Square or the turning of Ground Zero into the Dubai airport shopping experience. But the way in which this private provision of public space has become endemic, indeed the public default. This is an invidious reformulation of our democracy and reflects the more general pay-to-play mentality that dominates our politics. It certainly seems to be the norm here in New York. I saw a nice film last week called Citizen Jane, a documentary about the struggles between Robert Moses and Jane Jacobs. Those battles frame our current situation nicely, in that the contending forces were not exactly public and private interests, but two versions of the public. And in that the scene of the strife included both public and private arenas. Moses was the metaphorical and literal embodiment of public authority. And his special evil genius was precisely in constructing a version of public agency and public agencies that was not answerable to any form of democratic constraint. Moses ran roughshod over both private assets, the square miles bulldozed for his highways and housing projects, but lost his first big battle to Jacobs and her allies when he sought to intervene in that most public of public spaces, Washington Square. Jacobs' victory entailed retaining a vital piece of the public realm in public ownership for a specific public purpose: leisure, gathering, and free expression. Our current situation contorts these polarities in a tangled and dispiriting way. Increasingly, our parks, the jewel in the crown of our municipal assets, are obliged to maintain themselves via the tortured logic of so-called public-private partnerships. The current controversy over the attempt by the Hudson River Park Trust, a strange semi-public body charged with privately funding the maintenance and completion of the Hudson River Park, signifies an especially sad form of devolution of public responsibility. While perhaps spiritually related to the kind of user fees utilized in toll roads and parking meters, the difference is dramatic in that the income produced by the scheme to sell off air rights, or in the case of the Brooklyn Bridge Park, to sell off land within the park for high-end condos, seeks to profit from another use, one in which the pressure to most effectively grow the bottom line privileges a social class that enjoys a financial benefit from proximity to the amenity, while at the same time diminishing its quality for its primary users. In Brooklyn, historic views are blocked and space diminished. On the Hudson, shadows are cast on ball fields, traffic increased, and the rhythm of the city's edge wantonly altered. This, of course, is what's called a trade-off, and the strategy has long been embedded in our planning practices and polity. As we watch the radical alteration of our skyline by the construction of super tall towers, we're reminded of the now long history of deal-making, whereby we have sought to both conserve and exploit those most precious and shared assets: light, air, and view. Air rights are truly the nexus of the economy of public-private partnership because the municipality controls the supply and therefore the form, extent, and character of the city. Like the Federal Reserve, the planning department, via zoning, is in the position to mint air and to control its exchange. That exchange, however, is made between different currencies and is never zero-sum. There's always a loss of light and air, and we have almost no agreed standards for determining whether it's worth it. The watershed in establishing air rights as a fungible asset came with the revision to the city zoning law in 1961. In which the transferability of these rights was established. This was done as a means to serve certain public interests via a not entirely comfortable amalgam of incentive and coercion. The DCP website cites an historic range of planning and urban design goals, including protection of landmarks, facilitation of large-scale development, and securing the character of certain special districts, including the Seaport, the High Line, Grand Central, and the Theater District. Such transfers, of course, join the wider system of bulk bonusing that has generated the sad archipelago of privately owned public spaces, including Trump's lobby, sporadic arcading, and other bogus amenities bought too dear. More recently, bulk incentives have become the core instrument of Mayor de Blasio's efforts to create new affordable housing in the city. Here, the medium is so-called inclusionary zoning, an incentive system in which a bulk bonus is awarded to a developer who agrees to make 30% of the units in the project affordable. Setting aside issues with the definition of affordability, there's a leap of faith over the impacts of the 70% of market rate units on poor neighborhoods that might have a broader and ongoing availability of low-cost housing imperiled by this higher cost infusion. And here we return to the nub of both the problematic status of the bonus system and the ill-defined nature of its currency, the right to air. For me, the issues with incentivizing the private sector to provide some public good surround not simply the sad necessity for the public to beg and bribe its way to get someone else to fulfill its most primary obligations, but the slippery slope likely to receive a prodigious greasing in the next 4 years, by which those obligations are abandoned to privatization. It begins with saving landmarks and trying to get better architecture, proceeds to policing and sanitation via bids, moves on to parks and public spaces, thence to housing, on to Medicare and Social Security, to private prisons, to giving responsibility for our national defense to Halliburton, and to threatening those Estonians when they try to behave like Trump and stiff us for the protection money we demand. Where will it end? As our political sphere expands rightward, these questions, central to the very definition of a democratic polity, become more and more critical, and our answers seem to be simply situational. Spot ethics reciprocates with spot zoning, and this continues to move us further and further away from authentic collective planning. There are two additional effects of this privatized spot planning that should concern us. The first is the diminishing of our expectations for the extent of public action in the public realm. I heard a presentation last week from the director of the bike share program in New York and other cities, which he not simply touted as a huge success, but claimed that it was done entirely without public funding, as if it could exist without our providing and maintaining the streets, developing bike lanes, regulating other traffic, and so on. Don't get me wrong, I love those city bikes and I use them all the time. I'm also a strong advocate for remaking our movement culture in a way that gives bikes an enormously expanded role. But when our friend quelled about the transformative impact of a program that now has grown to 60,000 rides a day, I was caught up somewhat short by the tiny numbers. The subway provides 5.6 million daily rides, and our buses an additional 2 million. Elon Musk may get a dozen of us to Mars in 30 years on his own nickel, but it's the government that really moves us around town. The question here is of both scale and cooperation. The delirium as some wag has hilariously called the pier Barry Diller is building in the Hudson opposite his office, is expected to cost $200 million. I'm sure it will be fabulous. But the civic poverty of this gesture in the light of the contortions now being gone through to get $100 million to repair the invaluable Pier 40 is staggering. Barry could save the pier and still have $100 million left over to build his concert venues on it. Why doesn't he? At another recent presentation, someone showed a slide of a brownstone in Brooklyn that was being converted at a cost of $18 million from 11 rental apartments back to a single home, which brings us to a second effect. It is in the nature of these so-called partnerships that they tend to happen on sites that are already valuable. The $18 million conversion isn't happening in East New York, but Park Slope. Those condos are selling in Brooklyn Bridge Park because they're in a fabulous location right next to the Heights. The beautiful High Line, well, thanks again, Barry and Diane, wouldn't have happened in the South Bronx. Could the fact that the money'd pour their cash into Central Park and not Van Cortlandt have anything to do with the story reported in last weekend's Financial Times about the secure eternity of rising real estate prices on Fifth Avenue? Oh, sure, all these places are great, but private generosity almost invariably has a component of private advantage. And basing the future of our public realm on public-private deals will only further reify the gap between the rich and the rest. Public money is simply more accountable. One more page. The effects of trying to secure the general welfare from deals with big money can be seen especially vividly in the creation of freaks like the concoction proposed for the site opposite Pier 40, now working its way through ULURP. This 3-block stretch of Washington Street has become a kind of scape site on which a brace of towers would rise to 3 times the height of what's nearby in order to absorb enough density to finance the renewal of the pier and hundreds of units of affordable housing for seniors, which face, of course, the UPS parking garage. One can easily imagine, and not so long from now, a city dotted with such enormous dystopian piles, bonused to the sky to pay for what remaining public spaces and services the city is able and willing to offer without an entry fee. It's time to have a vigorous discussion about our air supply, about how we produce it, who gets it, and exchange for what. I don't have a complete answer, but I'm inclined to think that we should return to some version of a gold standard to back the creation of buildable air by something more absolute than an evanescent idea of the immediately desirable. One suggestion: the creation of new air be directly pegged to the supply of ground-level public space. Just a thought. Moore's article contains a wistful but critical aside. Quote, "One can hope for the day when the gradual loss of differentiated place, the gradual emerging of the gray no places, and the inundation of the places of special significance will cause the slumbering citizenry to awake, to demand to spend its money to have a public life. But it seems," he concludes, "unwise to wait for that." To be sure, the mantra of no new taxes seems to be writ for every member of our pusillanimous political class. And we can expect Trump and his junta not simply to act to reduce the amount of taxation absolutely, but, according to every credible analysis of his proposals, to further distort the progressivity of our tax rates to engorge the richest among us, some of whom, unlike the Donald, apparently haven't already discovered a way to evade taxes entirely. What we actually need is more democracy, more sharing of resources and responsibility. Our own version has long been informed by that hoary formulation, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. Progressive taxation for general revenue that is then allocated by our elected representatives is the tinkers to evers to chance of the American way. We all know the myriad tactics by which the system is distorted by wealth, influence, corruption, demagoguery, mean-spiritedness, and prejudice. But the formulation is central to the life of an authentic public sphere, and I believe we must struggle to restore not simply progressivity, but capacity to our system of taxation. The public life does cost money, and a system that requires either philanthropy from or a payoff to the private sector for its every initiative is a formula for the degradation of civil society and the abandonment of our commons to the greedy hyenas now so perfectly represented by the odious Trump. I don't believe that we have, in New York or in the nation, the democracy that we deserve, and that this is the outcome of the radical usurpation of power by a small, even dictatorial class of operators who understand only their own narrow interests. It's one thing that the less than 1/4 of the electorate that elected Trump has been conned, but another if the rest of us accept the very assumptions on which the plutocracy bases its own behavior. Enough of deals and trade-offs and pay to play. Time to share the wealth, time to share the city, time to pay for the public life.